My name is Amelia Malone. I'm the Director of Research and Innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to talk about what we know and what we can do about mental health needs of students with learning disabilities. So during our time together today, we're going to hear from clinicians and researchers working in the fields of psychiatry and education. We're also going to hear from our young adult leaders, who will lead us a discussion with our experts to build a roadmap for the future focused on actionable steps that we can take now to improve outcomes for individuals with learning disabilities. We have a lot to discuss with a really important topic. We hear over and over again that we are amidst a mental health crisis. The percentage of youth reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression have steadily increased over the past 10 years. Unfortunately, the pandemic has only increased the rate of decline. I want to highlight just a few stats that came out of a recent survey from the National Center for Education Statistics. So they are running a survey called School Pulse Panel, which assesses a wide range of variables across students' experiences during the pandemic. One facet, one pillar of this survey specifically looks at students' mental health and well-being. They found in the April 2022 report that 70% of public schools reported that the percentage of students who sought mental health services increased. Of those requesting mental health services, 25% of those individuals had individual education plans and were served under IDEA. 34% of those students were economically disadvantaged. And only 56% of public schools reported that they moderately or strongly agreed that their schools were adequately prepared to address the mental health needs of their students. For many in the learning disability community, mental health disorders permeate their everyday lived experience, even before the pandemic. Yet we know so little about why these disorders tend to co-occur. So we're here today to discuss these experiences, as well as to highlight trends in research and practice, and recommendations for best practices within schools for improving students' well-being. So we're going to begin our discussion with an opening from two members of our Young Adult Leadership Council, Stevie Mays and Rochelle Johnson. Hold on. Let me introduce them to everyone. I know that you guys know them, but I'm going to introduce them to our virtual crowd. So, Stevie Mays is a disability justice activist. Through joint internships with the American Association for People with Disabilities and National Association on Councils on Developmental Disabilities, they learned of the lack of support for disabled adults seeking employment and the lack of communication education for folks with AAC needs. Their current activities include working as a Reach Every Voice AAC instructor, as a nanny to 3 disabled cuties, and as a personal care assistant while going to school to become an AAC practitioner. They joined the YALC of the National Center for Learning Disabilities in September 2021. Rochelle is a learning disability activist and researcher and lives with dyslexia, ADHD, and anxiety. She has spoken with policymakers at various levels of government, advocating for policy changes and various bills. Rochelle is currently in her second year at NCLD's YALC. Recently, she was elected as the first ever YALC representative to NCLD's Board of Directors. Rochelle is currently a psychology PhD student at Florida State University, where she researches various factors related to the reading development of learning disabled people on an IES fellowship with the Florida Center for Reading Research. So I'm going to open it up to these wonderful YALC members to begin with an opening.
Dear the learning disability community and our allies.
As a nation, we are in a mental health crisis, one that disproportionately affects some more than others, including those with learning disabilities.
The U.S. is amidst a mental health crisis. A 2019 CDC report indicated 33% of high school students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. This number jumped to 44% during the pandemic. For many of us in the learning disability community, Mental health disorders permeate our everyday lives and lived experiences. Research supports a strong correlation between learning disabilities and mental health disorders. For example, one study found that individuals with learning disabilities report mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation at twice the rate of their non-disabled peers, even for when controlling for possible confounding factors. Another study reports comorbidity rates from 8.8 to 24.4% across a range of learning disabilities and mental health disorders. Yet, the causal relationship between learning disabilities and mental health disorders are still poorly understood.
Generally, poor mental health is associated with challenges in decision-making, difficulty in school, difficulty forming positive relationships, and other risky or potentially harmful behaviors. Dual diagnosis presents even greater challenges as many experience persistent stress, anxiety, trauma, bullying, internalizing problems, and feelings of social isolation as they navigate a world with learning disabilities and mental health disorders. These negative experiences help to explain, for example, why 1/3 of incarcerated individuals report having a learning disability, given mental health issues affect approximately half the prison and jail populations.
As members of the National Center for Learning Disabilities Young Adult Leadership Council, we feel it is imperative to kickstart a solution-driven mental health initiative focused on the intersectionality of learning disabilities and mental health disorders. Many of us live the life of dual diagnosis, which filters our worldview and sense of self. Research suggests that promoting a sense of belonging and peer social support within schools can protect learning disabled individuals from many documented negative outcomes. Yet, many of us experience various forms of educational trauma, such as persistent academic failure, feelings of inadequacy, low self-esteem, bullying, social isolation, and ridicule. Educational trauma refers to the perpetual pattern of harmful cycles within educational systems that detrimentally affect academic and emotional outcomes.
Many of us on the Young Adult Leadership Council describe our K-12 educational experiences as traumatic. Many describe feeling like no one understood them. Often they report failing to understand their own struggles and like they could not relate to the adults in the building or their peers. These struggles span well beyond weaknesses in reading, math, and arithmetic. Mental health disorders and learning disabilities are interwoven and inseparable, and these challenges follow us as we transition out of high school and into post-secondary school and the workforce.
This letter is a call to action, a call to our researchers, policymakers, educators, and parents and caregivers to better understand and address the mental health needs and solutions for individuals with learning disabilities. As well, to the LD community, we see your struggles and welcome your narrative to this larger story. Many advocate for decentralizing labels such as learning disabilities and mental health disorders to prevent individuals from the stigma. We embrace these labels as a roadmap for solutions that improved our lived experience. Disability diagnoses help build a blueprint for intervention and support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stevie and Rochelle. Their call to action requires us to develop a deeper understanding of how and why learning disabilities and mental health disorders tend to occur, and what we can positively change to impact students' experience. So I'd like to introduce you to today's experts who graciously flew from California today to join us. Dr. Ramsey Cascio is the Chief Clinical Officer at Children's Health Council located in Palo Alto, California. He is a clinician with over 25 years of experience treating students with co-occurring disorders such as learning disabilities, ADHD, and mental health disorders. He will provide a brief overview of general trends in student mental health needs and address whether he's observed any changes since the start of the pandemic, and whether declining mental health trends tend to disproportionately impact students from historically underserved communities. Dr. Bob Hendren is a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco Weill Institute for Neurosciences. He has published well over 150 scientific papers and 5 books, and has been listed in the best doctors in America each year since it was first published in 1996. He will provide a brief overview of what current research shows us about the overlap between learning disabilities and mental health disorders, and how both can be successfully addressed in interventions within the school setting. Dr. Nicole Olfeisch is the director of the Schwab Learning Center at Children's Health Council located in Palo Alto, California, and the Chief Innovation Officer at the Potentia Institute located in Half Moon Bay, California. She is a cognitive behavioral scientist with expertise in how cognition and the brain is associated with learning and performance, She will provide us with some perspectives on schools-based practices and models for supporting students' well-being and mental health. She will show how the science of learning and choice with universal design of learning can help boost student outcomes with learning disabilities and mental health disorders. We will then transition to watching a video with Dr. Temple Lovelace and me discussing current bright spots in schools and how measuring student engagement, belonging, and school-based environmental factors can help educators better serve students with learning disabilities and mental health disorders. Dr. Lovelace is a researcher in special education and the program director at the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund, in which she founded the program Assessment for Good. This program seeks to improve outcomes for students aged 8 to 13 by advancing the capabilities needed in a responsive and accessible system, assessing students' strengths to determine how best to meet their well-being needs. Dr. Lovelace could not join us in person today, but graciously participated in a recording Zoom session that we will all watch. Finally, our Young Adult Leadership Council members will share their stories and have an opportunity to ask questions and answer questions from our experts. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cascio.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you here today. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be able to speak about this important topic and to be invited here today. I do want to turn the gratitude around and thank Stevie and Rochelle and the entire YALC community for your passion in this space, for your advocacy, for your boldness. You are all the change makers who are going to make a difference. So grateful to you and elevating this conversation amongst the community. So thank you. We can go to our first slide. A couple of things that I want to always start out with is one thing that's really important to state is that we had a mental health crisis before the pandemic. Those of you with lived experience know that. Those of us in the behavioral health community knew that and see that. It was a public health challenge before the pandemic, and certainly the pandemic has exacerbated it. But I think it's important to pay homage to the fact that sometimes things happen in life and it increases our awareness, which is a good thing. But this is something that's been a problem for quite some time for young people. The other thing that's important to recognize is it's not just the pandemic. When you talk to individuals, and particularly young adults who are very attuned to what's going on in the world, it is the effects of the pandemic. It's the awakening around racial injustices. It is looking around and seeing the impact of climate change. It's concerns around the economy and what does that mean for young people who are trying to live a life. It's a war overseas, right? It's all of these heavy stressors that a lot of our young people have and that are carrying. And unlike older adults, young people just don't have the lived experience with these kinds of challenges and the coping strategies that naturally come about with those lived experiences. And so they're an especially vulnerable population, and that's why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation today. So if you look at the data, there's been a lot of data shared with you already today. I'm not going to read all the data from these slides, but I'm just going to highlight some of the most important ones. which is, and the data that I share is not like prevalence data of like mental health, diagnosed mental health issues. I think that's good data, but I think if we really want to get a sense of people's struggle, we have to kind of talk to young people and find out what are they endorsing, right? Whether it's diagnosed or not. So the data that I'm going to share is based on that. So before the pandemic, we had about 20% of young people endorsing that they were struggling with some mental health challenges. In the pandemic, through the pandemic, where we're at today, that number has jumped threefold. So 70% of young people are endorsing isolation, fear, anxiety, grief, all sorts of stressors that are really impacting their ability to function. And I want you to sit with that. 70% of young people endorsing some struggle. That's huge. Our youth are hurting, and we need to move to a place of help and support. We can't talk about mental health without talking about suicide. I know we don't like to talk about it, and we shy away from it, but we have to be able to openly talk about suicide if we're going to make a difference around prevention and post-vention efforts. But suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people. If you zero in on adulthood and you look at adults 18 and older, there are statistically significant increases in suicide attempts for what we call the transitional age population, that 18 to 25 year age group. If you also look at the LGBTQ plus community, that about 50% of individuals, youth in that community, stated that they have considered suicide and thought about it and experienced suicidality. So we really need to look at suicide as part of the conversation with mental health. We can go to the next slide. The other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that mental health and suicidality disproportionately affect young people of color and other oppressed groups like the LGBTQ plus community, typically to 2 times that of the general population. And in addition to that, because of our problems with our mental health system of care for youth, those communities, because of difficulties with equity and access to mental health services, are less likely to get the care. So higher risk, less likely to get the care. That's a problem area that we really need to focus on. So we all know the statistics with LD. You guys are pros with this. 1 in 5 young people have a diagnosed learning difference. You heard the stats that Stevie and Rochelle shared, but the latest statistics with regards to comorbidities with learning differences and mental health issues is about 40% of individuals with an LD have a concurrent anxiety, depression, other challenge that they're dealing with. We also know, the research shows, and what's been endorsed and anecdotally, is that young people with LD really struggled when we moved from shelter in place, going back into the school systems, increased levels of anxiety, self-esteem challenges, and just worries about the future. And this young adult, many of you are young adults who are in this space and experiencing this space. It's a very vulnerable time of life where you're really transitioning between being a kid and teen and being an adult. And we really have to pay special attention to that. So I'm just going to wrap it up real quick. So we have layers here, layers of difficulty. You have young adulthood, which is a really, really hard time, especially now. The challenge is to really create identity and a path forward. And with all of these stressors going on in life, it's hard to create a path forward when you don't know when the end of these issues are going to come. So the vulnerability of being a young adult is one layer. Having an LD is another layer, and then the layer of mental health on top of that. So I'm glad these conversations are happening. I'm glad there is advocacy happening. I do want to emphasize one of the things that's already been talked about. One of the things that we do at CHC really, really well, we've been doing it for years, is the integration of mental health and learning. You cannot provide good support to young people unless you address both. So everything that we do at CHC, we're always looking, whether it be evaluating or treating or educating young people, we're always checking in. Where is this person at with their mental health, and how can we support that? Where are they at with their learning, and do they have a learning difference? And it's only by the integration of the two that you can really help young people move forward to be successful and to thrive. So this is not all doom and gloom. I know these statistics don't sound good, but there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of increased awareness. The stigma is slowly decreasing, and there's people like you who are out in the community doing really amazing advocacy. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for having and inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be in DC. I appreciate the group that we're with. It's funny that 3 of us came from California. Do you think that's suspect, or do you think there might be some plan behind it? We don't all work together. We know each other, and the 2 of you work together more than I do. But I became interested in this overlap between LD and mental disorders when I was first in training as a child psychiatrist. And at Yale, there was a husband and wife team, the Shayowitzes, and they were in neurology, and they kept telling me, you know, if you're going to train as a child psychiatrist, you really need to understand something about learning disorders, something about dyslexia, because there's an overlap, and you psychiatrists don't get it. You somehow look only at the mental disorder, but not at the other part. In my first faculty job was here at GW, and I was struck as I started working in the schools that many of the teachers, many of the schools would overlook anxiety disorders or depression or ADHD or other things that seemed clear to me but weren't clear to them. And I thought, here we are, these 2 groups that don't talk to each other enough or don't pay attention to each other enough to really think carefully about it. So this is kind of repeating what you've already heard or what I've just said, talking about this overlap. Next slide. We started to look at a number of disorders, and you can see the variety of disorders that we see that co-occur or comorbid with. We use those 2 words sometimes interchangeably, but comorbid means they might be an expression of a similar or same disorder, the way different strands come together to create this one thing that we see at the end, but it got there in different pathways, versus co-occurring mean that they happen and they're separate. But you can see all the different things that range from ADHD to even autism spectrum disorder, to other learning disorders, OCD, anxiety, and depression. Next slide. We started a dyslexia center at UCSF through fundraising in a variety of places, and we got some good interest and help. The largest amount of it came from Charles Schwab, who really wanted us to better appreciate and study this overlap between mental disorders and learning disorders. We engaged 3 schools for kids with dyslexia in the Bay Area, Charles Armstrong School, Athena Academy, and the Chartwell School. And we asked them to enter 2 parts of our study. One was called a phenotyping study, and that tries to look at the different brain scan, neuropsych, variety of other sources that come together to say, there's not one dyslexia, there's a number of kinds of dyslexia, different pathways that you get there. It might be through executive function, it might be through stringing ideas together, it might be stringing syllables together, but there are different pathways that then need to be treated in different ways. So we then started to say, I wonder if those have any different expression of emotional factors as well. Could we look at what happens in outcome studies at the schools that I spoke about? And for almost 7 years, at least at one school and 5 for the others, we've been gathering information about anxiety, depression, a variety of other things. And the 2 that stand out the most to us, one is anxiety, and you can see the study that was published in the next slide, the results that show that anxiety significantly affects performance. So those kids with more anxiety tend to have more difficulty with reading. And as their anxiety gets less, their reading gets better. But the part of our study was we didn't know the directionality of that. We didn't know whether to say their reading disorder caused their anxiety, or their anxiety caused or made worse their reading disorder. But we found that many times in families, there was a family history of anxiety as well. And anxiety in the parent tended to affect anxiety in the child and anxiety around how well they did in these areas. So one of our areas of focus is to look in the future at that directionality. Next slide. Then if we think about anxiety, there's some parts that are obvious, like being hypervigilant, reactive, cope by avoidance, parental accommodation. But there are other ways that anxiety shows itself through physical symptoms, through inattention and poor performance. And it tends to become more noticeable between 6 and 12 and has a very common lifetime prevalence. So we work hard at saying, how can we identify anxiety and do something about it? Next slide. We can do things like positive, this is a whole talk, but or several hours of talking, but like positive reframing, thought challenging, control through competence, CBT. Next slide, and I'll bet most of you are familiar with all of these things and may practice them yourself. I would tell you I do for those anxiety moments, but yoga, breathing, biofeedback exercise, and mindfulness. Next slide. We then looked at the role of grit and resilience. Next slide. You can see that grit is a persistence of effort combined with a consistency of interest. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after something happens to you. We looked at grit and resilience at these 3 schools, all with kids with dyslexia, and found that it was highly correlated with how kids did. And the more grit and resilience they developed, the better they did. And those kids that didn't develop grit and resilience over the years tended to not do better in their dyslexia. Again, we didn't have the directionality. Did grit and resilience improve when their dyslexia improved? Did their anxiety affect their grit and resilience? How can we put those together? But our research question now is to say, how can we better affect grit and resilience? Going to a school for people with dyslexia tends to result in higher grit and resilience and less anxiety, because you're in a school, in a setting where you're understood and appreciated, and those schools try and teach positive coping mechanisms, how to be assertive, how to do things well. How could we do those things in public schools? How could we do those in disadvantaged neighborhoods? And I think that's my last slide. No, one more. So our conclusion is grit and resilience, and the way of trying to study that is going to be how it can be taught, how we can do better. And I hope that those of you in the audience will be those that maybe help study this more and more as we think about how can we do a better job? Because when we go to these schools that we see now for kids that are specially set up for kids with dyslexia, these kids thrive. They really appreciate being there. They do much better. We go to a school in a socially, economically disadvantaged neighborhood. They're in crowded classes, and these kids don't thrive at all. And the statistics we heard are worse coming out of that setting. So thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank everyone that spoke before me, because you really hit the nail on the head in terms of what the state of the state is with learning disabilities and mental health. And it's my hope that we can, in this portion, talk really about what we can do about it as schools and teachers and educators. The nice thing about everyone in this room is I would think our motivation is to make this world a more just and humane place for everyone. And that's a challenge when you talk about learning disorders because we all come from such vastly different environments. Some people are couch surfing, some youth are couch surfing, some are homeless. Some are going to schools for dyslexics that are $75,000 a year. So it's a very, very diverse population when we try and drive solutions. One of the theories that I've always grounded my work in is by the late Dr. Snyder, who did a lot of work in the late 90s and early 2000s. Snyder developed something called hope theory. Hope theory is a three-pronged theory that works really well for us driving solutions. It's easy for you to remember and think about. It goes like this. A person is full of hope, which allows them to feel like they have control and direction over their lives, which is what you've heard. We really need to help individuals with mental health and learning disabilities possess, by three things. They have to have a goal, they have to have agency, and they have to have strategies to get there. Before the pandemic, the part of hope theory that we as experts in learning disabilities and education hung our hat on was the learning strategies. You would find many, many individuals with learning disabilities had a goal, they had the agency or motivation to get there, but they simply didn't have the strategies. Either they were never really taught how to read, they were diagnosed as juniors or seniors in high school, so it was too late, and middle and high schools don't offer reading intervention the way elementary school does, which is a huge problem. That's a huge problem right there. You can't just go to a resource room in middle and high school and be told, well, you have accommodations now, and we don't have to teach you how to read anymore. We've got to keep you afloat in the content classes, biology, chemistry, computer science, etc. So we'll show you how to get through your textbook, and you're still struggling how to read or do math. So we've got to give students those strategies. We have to continue to teach individuals how to read beyond elementary school, and that is not an inherent part of our state and federal curriculum at the K through 12 level. It's a big thing we have to work on. Since the pandemic, we're seeing the second prong of hope theory become more impacted: agency. My ability to self-regulate, my ability to believe I can change the world, my ability to feel like I have control over what's happening in the world and my life, because I'm isolated now. I've been told I have to work in isolation, even on college campuses. More and more people are still being socially distanced, and people are feeling isolated. Individuals with learning disabilities are feeling alone and isolated. You go into neighborhoods which are predominantly black and brown, those kids don't feel safe in their schools. They just don't feel safe. How can you feel safe when there's so many school shootings? How can you feel safe when within 1 year of time you're seeing individuals who are black and brown brutally shot, and then there's police in your school that are supposed to protect you, which is very disconcerting for a lot of individuals. So those are these real issues that are impacting individuals' ability to feel like they have some agency. So what can we do as educators? We want to be able to make sure we are continuing to make sure our students have goals. Well, if we want our students to go on to college, we have to make sure they understand what is the SAT and ACT, and not at your junior year. It's too late for students at their junior year to realize, oh, a good score on the ACT is this, a good score on the SAT is this. How do I do that? When do I prepare? This has to be, I'm not talking about teaching to the test, I'm just talking about self-awareness, awareness. What is an AA degree? What is an AS degree? What is a BA degree? What is a BS degree? What's the difference between a grant, a scholarship, and a fellowship? A lot of students who came from families that don't have a legacy of people who graduated before them, they don't even know that basic information. And that's what we call academic capital. That's the beginning of discrimination right there. So we really, really need to be teaching our students what it means to articulate a goal in real life. The strategies are, let's teach them how to read. Let's teach them how to get accommodations. And let's use universal design for learning, because universal design for learning allows teachers to create a framework where students have choice, but we don't know how to help them to pick what would be best for them if we don't give them the option to try out these different choices. For example, all right, I'm going to teach you how to read. In the meanwhile, you need text-to-speech. Text-to-speech with a natural voice, an electronic voice, or do you need a reader? Or is there some Chrome extension that's going to work best for you? Students need to be exposed to all of this way before the end of school and start to articulate what works best for me with my learning disability. So when we can integrate agency, goals, and strategies, we can increase the level of hope for our students. And I know you all are working towards this goal, and I can't thank you enough.
First, let me say thank you so much for having me be a part of the Learning Disabilities Day of Action.
Well, thank you for joining us, Temple. You have such an amazingly deep level of expertise serving students with disabilities and really ensuring student voice is the center of the inclusive research and development process. Your research focuses on social justice from a disability lens, and your work strongly focuses on investigating innovative pedagogical practices designed to enhance learning opportunities and outcomes among Black, Latinx, and students experiencing poverty. Recent survey data from McKinsey & Company from parents during the pandemic suggests that students' mental health has rapidly declined. Anxiety and depression are pervasive among individuals with disabilities. This is especially true among individuals experiencing poverty. Disruptions caused by the pandemic have only cast a spotlight on an already known issue. From your perspective, what are schools already doing to address the holistic needs of students during this time? Are there any examples or bright spots that you can point us to?
So one of the things that we must understand as a starting point is that schools were already operating at a deficit when it comes to resources needed to support the holistic needs of learners in schools. However, even in that deficit, schools were implementing practices around wellness, such as supporting social development and emotional development, as they were also incorporating some great academic learning as well. What happened, though, was that there were schools and clinics that had to shift quickly to provide therapeutic supports. And so, unfortunately, for individuals with disabilities, especially those experiencing poverty, that small thread to some holistic supports that they had was severed. Some of the bright spots that had emerged were stronger remote learning capabilities that have persisted even as schools have gone back to more of a physical school building for learning. In addition, educators became more creative by instituting more check-ins with their learners, ensuring that they were able to maintain, if not grow, how often educators would be in community with learners with disabilities. We saw that stronger partnerships were formed between home and school, and that these partnerships were more intentional. Schools had a different ear. They had an open ear as to what was going on because they had to rely on caregivers to facilitate more learning and to implement interventions.
You have spent a great deal of time developing assets-based formative assessments to better understand students' well-being. What should schools be doing differently? How can schools address the needs of students with disabilities, students of color, and students with intersecting identities?
One thing that we do really well in school and in education is tell students what they can't do. We don't do nearly enough investigation into what is actually working really well. What are some thought processes that students implement really well? When we start to be able to understand that, then we can pivot and use that information for new areas of growth. We want to create a set of formative assessment that looks at students' assets. And then I want schools to also think about how are different groups of students impacted differently. So when we think about students of color, how might their experiences have been different, right? During the pandemic, before the pandemic, and what do we need to do differently to support their needs?
You described the need for developing assets-based formative assessments so that we can better understand students' well-being. Specifically, what information and data should be collected by these assessment tools? For example, by the ones that you are developing at Assessment for Good. And how can schools use this information to support student mental health and well-being?
Our formative assessments focus on 3 areas. We first look at the strengths in the social and emotional space for learners. We also want to understand the well-being of educators, right? So what are the ways in which we can see what supports that they may need or the assets that they have? And then the third is the environment or the climate. What are the ways in which we can measure how well the climate is supporting social development, emotional development? If schools have that information, they can pivot more quickly and they can create safe and more welcoming environments for students with disabilities.
How do you see integrating these data into the development and implementation of strengths-based individual education plans, commonly known as IEPs?
So when I think about the power of the individualized education plan or the IEP, it's a document that would tell me as an educator what I need to do to best meet the needs of that learner. And the good thing about the IEP is that it's supposed to be comprehensive.
Right.
They can only be as comprehensive as the inputs that we have available. Our tools are largely self-report tools. And so we believe that our tools will actually allow for student voice, for family caregiver voice to also be a part of this process. And so it provides that information from a strengths-based perspective. And then it is available for all of the individuals that might, be a part of the team that's supporting this learner and their family. And so for us, we absolutely believe in an integrated approach, a comprehensive approach. If we all know this information, then we're able to make better decisions in the individual corners of support that we provide for a student.
Absolutely, and all in the service of students themselves. I wanted to thank you, Temple, for taking the time with me today. We very much appreciate your voice on this panel. You have such a depth of expertise, and your work, specifically focusing on inclusive research and development in this space, is groundbreaking.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for having me be a part of the LD Day of Action.
Thank you again to the panelists for being here. I learned a lot from each of your presentations, so it was really insightful. So I would like each of you to share that based on your own lens into the topic of mental health, what do you see as bright spots for addressing the needs of students?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that I like to say about the pandemic and everything else that we're experiencing and that's going on is that nobody has escaped unscathed in terms of their mental health and wellness. We've all experienced grief, isolation, stress, worry, fear. And I think what's happened is that the world has put a mirror up to us, and there is this greater awareness of mental health and mental well-being. And we see people, we see the struggle in ourselves, we see it in our neighbors and our kids and our parents. And so we've really been able to take a hard look at the fact that mental wellness is important. It's as important as other physical health issues. And I think with that greater awareness comes action and comes a decrease in some stigma.
That was kind of what I was thinking. So, good answer. But I think the last few years have changed our openness to mental health issues, the pandemic, the struggle people have had, but also this real effort to talk about a crisis in children's mental health that we hear in a variety of ways. And then I think your letter was really nice. As you know, I read an earlier version and offered unsolicited comments. So, but the comment that I had made was that I hope that I understand you're feeling angry, but rather than just feeling angry in the letter, that you have a call to action, or you have people feel empathic and understand, and you've really captured that in this letter. I just think it's really nicely done. And I think, in a sense, being able to go on with what we've had from this crisis in children's mental health to then go on to a crisis in children's mental health and learning disorders is really a great move. So I think that's a bright spot. You got another answer?
I do, but as always, you always just kind of segue into what I'm going to say. I love it. It makes my work so easy. I can just wax philosophically at this point. So I see the bright part is rising advocacy among youth, fueled in part by anger, frustration, and TikTok. And I mean that seriously. TikTok has been awesome because during the pandemic, during the shootings, during political unrest, students are getting out there and they are shooting these videos screaming about how frustrated they are and what we need to do. This has allowed the voices of youth to be heard, and slowly more and more adults are allowing the voices of youth to have a seat at the table. Do not stop. We need to get the voice of youth at the table. This is part of even the design thinking experience in education and business. In order to build empathy, adults have to listen to the individuals they think they're creating these programs for. You have to have a seat at the table. And I see that happening more and more. And I think that's a bright spot.
So another question for all three of you. What interventions have you seen or studied that have been successful at limiting the impact someone's learning disability has on their mental health?
Yeah, so at Children's Health Council, we have this amazing school called Sand Hill School, and it's for individuals with learning differences and co-occurring mental health struggles. And what's amazing about it is that it's a community for young people that understands, again, the integration of learning differences and mental health, and the school community addresses both. There are educators, parents who understand learning differences. There's remediation that's happening at the academic level. There's speech and language and occupational therapy and mental health resources being pushed into the classrooms. We have things like, stand-up desks for young people who can't sit still. And, why in this country do we still ask young people with ADHD to sit down for 8 hours, and then they get in trouble if they wiggle or get up and sharpen their pencil for the 10th time that day, right? So we have stand-up desks, and the stand-up desk has a little leg swing so that you can move. And with young people with ADHD or sensory integration challenges, that movement and that helps them learn. So we have to create communities where people understand not just the learning difference, but the mental health challenges that may or may not be associated in primary or secondary. And I think in doing that, we can help shift.
So I think that's a good answer. So without repeating that, I would add what I started on a little bit in the talk of trying to phenotype or try to understand the kind of learning difference. So too many times people have a way that their reading difficulty or whatever is thought of it this way. So they go to Linda Mood Bell and that doesn't work. And then they go try this and that doesn't work. And then they gradually get discouraged, and then someone says, well, it's because they're not trying hard enough, or they're lazy, or other things that then kind of begin to beat you down. And I think it's going to be increasingly helpful, and I think it's not just our group, it's many other groups that are looking at saying, could we better identify the learning difference that someone's having so that we could better target it, so that someone could say, oh, I understand what my difficulty is. I'm having trouble putting these syllables together, and maybe if I worked on that, that would be better. But for another, that's not it at all. It's, no, you just are really having trouble focusing, and maybe we can help with your attention, that we could do better things rather than say one size fits all.
So a good continuation of what Bob is saying is, and then teach individuals self-awareness of what's happening so that they really understand, why am I having difficulty paying attention when I'm reading? Or why am I having trouble decoding this word? And why does everyone just focus on reading, but I'm really having trouble in math too? Because we know that learning disabilities, a reading disorder, is more than reading. It affects you all across the board. It's how you see the world. It's how your brain is hardwired. So helping students to become more self-aware of how it actually plays out for them in the moment at school and work helps to destigmatize, I have dyslexia too, see? And to destigmatize the condition. Along those lines, when we destigmatize the condition, we help students to see that they are not the sum reflection of their report card, which is a really big deal. In elementary school, kids are going out on the playground exchanging what grades they got. It keeps going forever. And they think that this is a life sentence. They think their report card is going to dictate their outcomes in life. We need to teach them that this is not a reflection of who you are. You are a whole person. You are the sum of your experiences. So all of that comes under the rubric of self-awareness. And beginning with what Bob was saying, this is how my reading disorder plays out, and this is what it means for me in real life and what to do about it.
So for Ramsey, you shared some information about mental health trends among distinct groups of students. What limits exist in terms of collecting better or more actionable data for research and policy interventions?
Yeah, I would say two things. And this is why I like to use data about what young people and their parents and educators are endorsing versus the more traditional, what does the research say is the prevalence of a certain diagnosis or diagnosed condition. So, and the reason is because there's still a stigma. We're making some progress, but there's still a stigma around mental health. And so even the data that we're looking at we have to just assume that it's an underreporting of data, right? People still don't feel comfortable acknowledging and endorsing mental health struggles. And that's understandably even more so in traditionally oppressed populations and groups. There isn't safety, there isn't trust. I'm not going to share my vulnerable experiences with this government-based survey. So one of the limits is that the fact that we don't know what the real prevalence of mental health issues are in this country for youth. The other is that we do a lot of research in the adult space. And when we do research in the adult space, we're really doing research in the sort of mid to older adult space. And we have a bad habit as researchers sometimes of taking that adult research and applying it to kids and applying it to even young adults. A 25-year-old's experience is not the same as a 55-year-old's experience, right? And so we have to do better in terms of researching, doing research specifically based on young adult populations and kid populations. And I would say those are the two limiting variables that we have.
So this question is for Bob. Your career includes work as both a scientist and a physician, focused on disabilities like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, which is an interesting lens into the topic today. Where do you see the biggest gaps in our understanding, and what are the opportunities for researchers and physicians to work together to expand our knowledge?
When I was a little kid, I wanted to be an outer space explorer. And I studied the planets, and I built my own telescope, and I used to look at all these things in the unknown. I wanted to explore outer space. And then in the 7th grade, I took a course in earth science, and I realized what I'd mostly be studying is rocks, and that's not really very interesting. So there was a show on television about a psychiatrist and a psychologist called The 11th Hour, and it talked about mental illness or mental disorders or the way the brain worked. And I thought, that's like inner space exploring. That's what I'd like to do. So it's such an unknown area, has been such an unknown area, and I think what's really changing is that we're starting to learn how the brain works and how it comes together, not just in symptoms that we see from the outside and not just with genes that we have from the inside, but the way genes express themselves and go through the body and the way things wire together. And we understand not by looking at one symptom or one part of the brain or one neurotransmitter, but by understanding the way circuits fit together. And I think that's an exciting new part of what's happening in neuroscience, is that we can begin to appreciate that. I tell that my wife is French, and our daughter went to school in France and found a guy from France that she married, and he was from Alsace, and we went to visit his family, and they said, would you like to see some wineries? And we said, sure. We went, and you might recall Alsace-Lorraine carved out a kind of swath of earth, and the people at the wineries would say, what makes our wine so great is our terroir. It's the different layers of clay and ash and all the other things that go into giving the terroir, and that is what makes the grape good. But it's not just that. It's also the amount of rainfall and the amount of sunshine, but it's not just that. It's the souls of the people tilling the soil in that land that makes our wine so really good. That's our terroir. And I thought, well, that's the way kids grow brains. There's all those things that go into their terroir, and we're appreciating to not work at just one level, but appreciate the different levels and how we can make different connections to make a good cépage, a good grape, through the terroir that we're nourishing.
So this question is for Nicole. In your work, you focused on this idea that individuals with learning disabilities should thrive, not just survive. I agree. Can you talk about what you see in the school environments where students are thriving, and what can be done to help these students thrive?
Students who are thriving feel safe at school. They feel like they have a voice in the lives of their teachers and in the leadership. And they feel visible. They don't feel invisible, that no one sees them. And they feel that someone understands them and can provide them the educational resources they need. You know, the first layer of the brain is emotion. Everything we do to teach a child how to learn has to get through this layer of emotion. So safety, compassion, love, empathy, that has to be intact before we start teaching. You all know how hard it is to get over a failure. You're overwhelmed with those feelings, and you've got some teachers say, come on, you'll get over it, and you're still processing what happened. So that's an example of how much we have to make sure the brain is safe and receptive before we can provide educational resources. Along those lines, that's not enough. We have to understand that all of our students have the potential to articulate their strengths and gifts, and we have to help them find ways through basic skill instruction, learning strategies, technology, collaboration with other professionals, and accommodations to help them get there. That allows an individual to survive, to thrive, rather than survive from one failure to the next. We want them to learn from what they've struggled with and move on and grow and really, really thrive and be a contributing, happy member of society.
So we're going to shift gears just a little bit. As we're discussing, I consistently hear the theme of the importance of community, leaning on one another, but also ensuring that we are implementing these evidence-based practices and ensuring that we are talking about the whole child to ensure success. We're going to shift and talk about individual experiences and then give you guys an opportunity to ask questions. So Rochelle's going to go up first, and then Stevie, and then they're going to ask some questions of the panelists, and then again, we'll open it up to you guys.
At 5 years old, I loved to learn, and I was excited to start kindergarten. By 6, I was being bullied by my teachers and classmates for my inability to read. By 7, I felt like I didn't belong in school, and I felt I wasn't smart. I was ashamed of my learning disability, and I tried to hide it. By 8, I was having chronic migraines in the classroom and had to leave school early consistently because of it, because of stress. And I started having panic attacks weekly in the classroom. By 9, I was diagnosed with anxiety. The main fear listed on my diagnosis was a fear of being abandoned intellectually. I felt like my classmates were going to get so far ahead academically that I would be left in the dust and never be able to catch up. I didn't understand how abnormal it was to have this level of anxiety at such an early age. Looking back at the adults around me at this time, it seems that they were surprisingly unconcerned for this level of anxiety I was experiencing at this young age, as the main focus was always on getting me to read, but never about why I felt completely inadequate and like an outsider in the classroom. I wouldn't fully understand anxiety or what it was until middle school, and I didn't receive therapy or meds for my anxiety until 19, and that was after I had developed depression as well. My anxiety became highly disabling in the classroom. I would get so overwhelmed, I felt like my brain couldn't think. I would miss classroom instruction because I couldn't breathe, and I had to step out. I felt like no one around me really understood why I was struggling and why my mental health was as low as it was. While my anxiety was often caused by feeling like I couldn't learn fast enough, the resulting anxiety made learning even harder. I continued to have these weekly anxiety attacks in the classroom through senior year of high school. In middle school and high school, I was just known as the girl who cries a lot. As I continued to have these panic attacks weekly or biweekly, I would set these goals for myself that I wanted to go 2 weeks without having an anxiety attack in the classroom, but I rarely met that goal. In high school, anxiety became the main reason that I was on an IEP, because that was the main symptoms they could see of why I was struggling in the classroom. This fear and anxiety has persisted, and is still something I am struggling with today, going into my second year as a PhD student. I experience extreme imposter syndrome being learning disabled. Being in academic settings, in a space that did not have me in mind when built and is not made for me. So many people throughout my life told me I would not succeed, and there's always this fear that what if they're right? I have come this far in my achievement, but what if at any moment it comes crashing down? In talking with the Young Adult Leadership Council, I have learned that my story is not unique, but instead start a part of a systemic issue that we are not addressing, the issue of the mental health needs of the learning disabled community. I cannot be, and we cannot be, one of the few learning disabled activists and researchers addressing this issue and talking about it. I need researchers, policymakers, family members, and educators to stand with us in this movement. I need you, the learning disabled community, to reflect on your story, and when you're ready, share your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. That was great. I'm going to lower this a little. Okay. My mental health illnesses, depression, anxiety, and learning disabilities are inherently intertwined with my whole being and life. While depression was a possibility that could have been triggered by any life event, the explicit discrimination of a private Catholic school denying me on the basis of learning disabilities triggered it for me. By 8th grade, I figured out I was dyslexic due to media representation. The hearing of my other diagnoses of dyspraxia, dysgraphia, and ADHD for the first time in the same sentence of being denied access to the high school all my family, including my aunts, and much of my community were going to, had me hating the disabled parts of myself. I began to have intrusive thoughts about my dyslexia daily while in school. School triggered my racing self-hatred of my disability. I felt I had no choice but to check out. I later found out this was diagnosable and since treated PTSD. On good days in high school, I was numb. On bad days, I felt so low being in classrooms, it felt excruciatingly painful. My test scores reflected high potential not being reached. Deemed not worthy of getting help from school counselors as they presumed my just above 2-point GPA was a behavioral problem or just not adjusting to the academic rigor of high school and not being seen as someone with intense depression and anxiety. Halfway through my junior year, I discovered websites such as Understood, National Council for Learning Disabilities, and the American Association for People with Disabilities. This was my first time seeing folks proudly proclaiming their disabilities. This coalition of disabled avengers of sorts thrilled me. I began doing projects on learning disabilities, and while I felt alone, claiming my LD identity helped alleviate some of the racing negative thoughts about my disabilities. Today, depression and my ADHD are very much present most days. Much better managed with medication and a reformed relationship with my learning disabilities and mental health. I occasionally find myself hating those parts where ADHD and depression affect me. My scatteredness, my lack of organization, the quickness I can find myself overwhelmed is impressive. However, instead of others ignoring or getting frustrated by such, I explain how my learning disabilities and mental health permeate my life, and at a minimum, I receive love and sympathy, sometimes even support from friends and loved ones. It is imperative you leave today understanding learning disabled students are working in systems that predispose them often to traumatic experiences or educational trauma. While mine is one example, there are many more of what learning disability and mental health can look like. Parents need to have this space to chat with IEP teams about these distressing moments their students are experiencing. Those conversations need to be led by someone knowledgeable in mental health, as mental health disorders can become generationally normalized. For example, had a mental health professional asked me about how distressing homework was or tests were in 5th or 6th grade, I may have been able to avoid the literal panic attack I had before completing every, and let me be clear, every homework assignment I had from 5th grade through college, which my mom considered normal, as she often did the same growing up. Normalizing and infusing mental health check-ins with your clients, students, loved ones is critical in stopping the cycle of poor mental health outcomes of learning disabled students. I'm so grateful for my time on the Young Adult Leadership Council. While sad, many of us have experienced mental health issues ourselves that are influenced by our learning disabilities. I know and we know we are not alone. I am sure many of the folks at Eye to Eye feel the same. I feel empowered knowing each and every one of us in this room are going to continue our lives advocating to make this society more inclusive, less traumatic, and better treatment on learning disabilities and mental health. Or at the very minimum, you know now that it's a damn issue that we need to address and challenge. I want to thank my mentors, professors, chosen family, and friends. Your love and supports get me through every day.
Rochelle, Stevie, thank you for sharing such powerful stories. Our panelists have prepared a few questions for you about your experiences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was powerful. Thank you for sharing your vulnerability and your hearts and your minds with us. We know why you're here and why you do what you do. In addition to that, we're interested in hearing what you wanted to see happen as a result of this discussion.
I like that. I don't remember which of you fabulous researchers mentioned that you've done school-level research on successful implementation of programming to better student well-being and mental health. I think for me, as someone who has worked very tangential to teachers, I've been an educator for autistic folks in a variety of ways for many years. I recognize that if you can change teachers' mindsets on how to approach and analyze and really watch for their student mental health, that could be a great benefit. I found, and I'm sure many of the fellow advocates found, that growing up, my poor performance was almost always tied to my learning disability. And there was never a question or an evaluation of, am I depressed, am I anxious? So having teachers be aware that that is a possibility and something they actually need to explicitly be looking out for is a great start.
Yeah, so going off of that, I feel like just generally we need to talk about the parts of being learning disabled that aren't the actual like learning disability. Like for dyslexia, it impacts you beyond just like struggling with reading because so many of us, like yesterday, I was so taken aback but not surprised when all of us were meeting with the Department of Education and they asked, how many of you were called lazy? And I don't think I saw one person in the room without their hand raised. And like so many of us have experienced that, and we need to talk about how experiences like that are so common in the learning disabled community impact us, impact our education. We're not just struggling with things like math and reading and writing, we're also experiencing life as learning disabled people who have very specific experiences. So I think as teachers and policymakers and researchers, we need to be talking about how these other factors play into the development of the reading disabled community. And I think looking for mental health disorders in learning disabled students, like we've talked about from the beginning, the higher rates, why aren't we just like, it's easy to throw in a very short depression questionnaire into those every 3-year IEP meetings or IEP reevaluations, just checking in, or talking to learning disabled students, saying, like Stevie was saying in their story about what does it feel like to have anxiety? What is a normal level of stress? And when is it a mental health disorder? And when do you need to reach out for help? And I think just spreading that information and having more conversations about the parts of being learning disabled that are not reading and math.
Thanks. We were given some potential questions to ask, and they were good questions, but I feel like you've kind of answered them, so I'm going to branch out a little bit, if I could, just in another area. As you think about learning disorders or dyslexia and mental health issues, do you think of them as like a Venn diagram where they're two separate circles and they don't come together? Or do you think of them as overlapping? And is there some part of the overlapping that's not only something that makes you sad or is difficult, but there's some part of it that's an advantage. And I think our governor in California, Gavin Newsom, has dyslexia, and he talks really poignantly about he has a different way of thinking, and it helps him problem solve differently. Or there's a researcher that has talked about people with dyslexia do better with making longer connections. People with autism do better making short connections. And they're both at opposite ends of that spectrum, but are there long connections that you feel, or are there advantages when you think about this overlap in the way that you conceptualize yourself?
I like that that question approaches the disabilities as a holistic part. I think for one thing, it's always important to state that inherently when you have a learning disability, there are going to be aspects that are disabling, right? That's just a part of the game. But some of the, as well, actually, I just want to share, in preparation for this meeting today, Rochelle actually did draw the Venn diagram, and it was like, take a look, here's the overlap of ADHD and learning disabilities and the mental health and anxiety and depression. So we've used that Venn diagram analogy before. I feel like, for me, I think back about from high school and younger, if I could just sit in a classroom, wasn't required to take notes, and just watch the teacher present and really listen, and if the topic interested me, I could retain at least 50% of what was being said to me in that moment, in that time. I think maybe it's the combination of the ADHD push, but I can do exceptionally well under pressure in terms of retaining information to then put it down on a test. As well, I recognize that because I am such a audio processor that I feel I do have strengths in verbally expressing myself that I likely would not have such a strong skill set in if I wasn't dyslexic. So.
Yeah, so I would say first, like, dyslexia, learning disabilities, all of this are disabilities, and I think we need to talk about them that way. And I would say they are disabling for sure. And I don't know if I would say it's like better to, like, I wouldn't, sorry, I'm trying to think about how I want to phrase this. I would not say there are like superpowers that come with like being dyslexic or whatever, like, but I also wouldn't say I'd ever not want to be dyslexic. Like if someone like gave me a pill and was like, this is gonna like take away your dyslexia forever, I'd be like, no. But if they were like, you could take this pill for like, and you'll like be able to read better for like an hour, I'd be like, okay. But like I wouldn't want to like fundamentally change my brain. But I do think dyslexia does make things harder inherently, and I think it's made me think about the world differently, not necessarily because I have dyslexia and that's the way my brain is wired, but because of the experiences that I have had and the way that I have to approach things because of the struggles that I've had. And I'd say one thing that I am happy to have happened because I'm dyslexic is having a community like this. Having a learning disabled community who I can relate to and approaches things so similarly. A lot of us were just hanging out last night and like struggling with like just trying to order at a restaurant, and all of us were just like couldn't read it because part of it was in Spanish and all of us were LD. It was a whole mess, but it was so funny. The waiter was very stressed because we were just pointing, but like it's just like that part of being LD I am so thankful for, because it's just such a unique experience to this community.
If I can add one more quick thing, I also appreciate when I'm with the LD community that the normal flow of conversation is literally all over the place, but we can keep track of it much easier than my non-neurotypical peers.
Thank you. I want to open it up to all of you. Do any of you have questions? And if so, please come up and sit in my spot and use the microphone so that you are captured on the live stream.
Hey, y'all. For the live stream, I'm Madison. I'm part of the Y'all Council, and I identify as having dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, and what feels like a mess of medical, including persistent depression disorder, and probably eventually going to be diagnosed with some sort of anxiety. How do we keep people who are struggling already with mental health, as well as being learning disabled, when things are going wrong? Because there is this, it feels like a trend, I don't know if y'all would agree, that it's almost like once you get one, you just start kind of like collecting them.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How do we make it so we essentially help our community from struggling so much when we end up getting this like collection of things from physical to mental to psychological?
I feel like one thing that's happened for me, I feel like I have been just collecting more neurodivergent disabilities over the years, both ones that you develop and just have been lifelong. But I feel like talking about our experiences has been helpful to me, like hearing from other learning disabled students and being like, oh wait, like I experienced that, I thought it was this, but maybe it's this. I feel like talking about our experiences is very helpful for that. And then sharing resources. I think that it can be difficult as students to figure out like what accommodations are there for learning disabilities? What are the resources for me? And it's not really centralized too well what those are. When you go into an accommodation meeting, you have to just basically tell them what you want. They're not going to be like, here's a list. Like they'll give you a short list, but it's not every single one. And I think sharing of our wealth of information, even just in this room, so many of us have so much information from our lived experiences of what works. And I think as you were saying, like collect all these disabilities and trying to figure out where they separate is like sharing what has worked for us and what we wish we had, and then coming together and advocating for the things that we don't have.
We're going to move on to the next question.
Hello, panelists. I thank you for coming and being here. Let me take a breath quick so I can be calm and collected. My name is Eric Marcotte. I am a sixth-year college student at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and I'm studying chemistry. Started out as wanting to pursue pharmaceutical chemistry, but then moral-wise, I was looking for something more, so that I went into environmental chemistry to try to do what I could to help mitigate climate change. And from there, and where I'm at now, is a standpoint that that climate change and mental health crisis is the intersection of neglectance, human neglectance. And that has led me to be interested in brain chemistry because of the social aspect of that plays with the neglect. And one issue that I see in regards to brain chemistry is that students and people with LDs are often pumped full of drugs or prescriptions and told that that's often pumped full of drugs that are taking away from their appetite. And my big question is, what is the leading research and development in brain chemistry when it comes to LDs? And how does nutrition play a role in that?
There's an increasing body of knowledge that nutrition is helpful for brain health, for ADHD, for having a resilient brain, a lot of things. And that can have to do with diet. There are some micronutrients that have been studied, and there are a variety of other things, and they have when we do research, as you know, there's an effect size. So the size of that effect says, whoa, this really works if it has a big effect size, or it says it works a little bit if it doesn't have as big of an effect size. When we look at whether active separates from placebo. And most of these studies show very modest effect sizes. They show a change. Whereas a stimulant for somebody who has ADHD, shows a great big effect size, and it happens almost immediately. So those things have to be weighed, I think, by families and by the person, saying, and you can do both. You could say, well, is there some way that I could improve my performance enough that I can get my best performance out? And maybe I don't need to do it all the time, but I want to grow a healthier brain, so I'm going to take these things that help with that as well. And there's similar comparisons for depression and anxiety and other things. And for me, in my whole earth model, I kind of say, well, let's do it all, if we can, rather than not do it. But for family members that come or others and say, I don't want to take those psychotropic drugs, I say, well, there's some alternatives, and here's what we can do. And I think that's a fine way to go, too.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
For the interest of time, we're going to constrain the questions. We're going to ask 2 more very short questions. Eliza.
Hello, my name is Eliza. I'm a student at Oberlin College. My question is, I've worked with students with learning disabilities in the past, and I'm also a student with a learning disability. What I am wondering is how can educators and educational institutions in general, particularly K through 12 schools, support students with learning disabilities who have mental health conditions? That's a question for anyone.
I'll answer from an educational perspective and then quickly give it over to Ramsey. I think when students know that they're making academic performance, when they're succeeding academically towards the goals that they've co-created with their educators, it can have a significant impact, positive impact on their mental health, which speaks to all the educational strategies that we were talking before. So they've got to see progress.
Thank you, Nicole. Ramsey, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, do you want me to answer?
Short.
We need to have, as Nicole mentioned earlier, we need to have school systems, private and public, that acknowledge that social emotional wellness and learning is just as important as academics, and actually act on that. So checking in with students at the beginning of the day. How are you showing up today? Taking movement breaks, really putting into practice some of the things that we know helps young people learn better.
Thank you. Okay, our final question, which actually was a combination of the last 3 questions. So I do want to recognize that a number of people had questions.
So hi, my name is Lizzie. I'm a student at Coastal Carolina University. My question is, so it's no secret that students with, and just people with learning disabilities, a huge thing that goes with it is self-esteem. But then also PTSD, which I'm curious about, like the intersectionality and how one can affect the other.
Yeah, we do see a lot of overlap of trauma, and as some folks mentioned today, some of that trauma is actually part of the educational system. If you imagine, you're a young person with a learning difference, you're constantly comparing yourself against your peers. It takes you longer to do things. Your teachers are telling you to hurry up. You're not well supported. All of that, and constant fear of not being good enough, not doing well enough, not acting fast enough, that can create a sort of this kind of low-grade chronic trauma that one is living within. That's really a systemic fix, and why there needs to be a lot of advocacy around education reform.
I would like to answer that as an adult with dyslexia who was not diagnosed and was told by her college counselor that she was not college material, but there was a place where I could do hair and nails. Now I have this international reputation in learning disabilities and accommodations. So I'm going to speak from my own personal experience. It takes time to really, really make peace with the struggles that you've had. And it happens with every decade over time. And it's my hope that everyone in this room who is struggling with learning disabilities makes peace with the struggles, finds ways to excel, articulate their strengths and gifts, and end up at a point in their lives where you love who you are. You love who you are, and you understand that the contributions that you make and the way you see the world is an outstanding contribution to the world because it's different, but it's a good thing. And it will take time to come to peace with that, but it's my hope that everyone does, because then it becomes a real celebration of your strengths and gifts and a celebration of the resilience that you've had to make it where you are.
What a way to end. Thank you. So finally, Nicole, no, sorry, not Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. Finally, Stevie and Rochelle are going to finish with one more call to action, and then we'll be done.
Today you've heard different research, clinical, and school-based perspectives on the mental health crisis facing students with learning disabilities. It is imperative that we start to talk about the effects of learning disabilities beyond their impacts on learning, but also their impacts on how one interacts with the world and views themselves. Our mental health is an important part of our identities as disabled young adults. Today, we share with you a call to action for researchers, policymakers, educators, parents and caregivers, and the LD community.
For researchers, our ask is to broaden research efforts to better understand the intersectionality of mental health and learning disabilities, accounting for experiences of the BIPOC, LGBTQ, and historically other marginalized populations.
For policymakers, increase funding for early intervention, treatment, and psychological supports within schools.
For educators, improve awareness of the interconnectedness of mental health and learning disabilities and strategies to intervene and mitigate poor outcomes.
For parents and caregivers, provide evidence-based education on early warning signs of mental health issues and how to promote self-advocacy in your children to improve outcomes.
And for our learning disabled peers, accepting and embracing your learning disability and disability status will not only give you access to services, but will provide a greater understanding of the self and provide a community ready to welcome you with open arms. We see your mental health struggles, and it is time to shine a light on the mental health aspects of our learning disability stories.
This is a call to action. This call to action is only scratching the surface on a larger conversation. Our voices matter. Join us in amplifying it.